The barber who shaves you today is the descendant of the man who used to amputate your leg. They sat in the same chair. They often held the same blade. For centuries, the man who trimmed your beard also pulled your teeth, drained your blood, and sawed off your limbs. And the red and white pole outside every shop in the world is, in its origin, a blood-stained staff wrapped in bandages. Most people get the status question backwards. The medieval surgeon was lower on the social ladder than the physician, not higher. The learned doctor refused to touch blood. That was manual labor beneath his dignity. So the man holding the saw was the barber, the tradesman, the physician most despised. Modern surgery, the most prestigious profession in medicine, was born from the trade the physician was too proud to do himself. Walk down any high street, past the dry cleaner, the bakery, the nail salon. Outside the barbershop, a pole spins, red and white, sometimes with a stripe of blue. Most people see a haircut sign. What they are looking at is the advertisement for bloodletting. The colors are not decorative. Red is blood, white is the bandage. The pole itself, in its earliest documented form, was a wooden staff on which the barber hung his cloths after a procedure. A London ordinance from 1307, cited by the medical historian Lindsay Fitzharris, forbade barbers from displaying bloody bandages in their windows. They were doing exactly that. The pole outside the shop was not a decoration. It was a drying rack, hung outside so the wind could catch the stains. The pole twisted because the wind twisted it, and the spiraling stripe became the shape that lasted, even after the stains themselves were gone. Walk inside. The chair is the same chair your barber sits you in today. A high leather chair, built so the customer's head could be tipped back for shaving and tipped forward for bloodletting. The basin at the foot was for the lather and for the blood. The razor was sharpened between uses. The blade that took whiskers off a chin in the morning took an abscess open in the afternoon. The barber's customers came for shaves and haircuts. They also came for things no modern customer would associate with the chair. A tooth pulled with a turn of the wrist, an abscess lanced with the same blade used to open a vein, a boil cut to drain, a hemorrhoid cauterized, and, when the surgeon's work required it, a leg sawed off above the knee, the patient gripping the arms of the chair or a wooden post as the saw bit into the femur. The barber-surgeon did not separate these services because he was not yet a barber or a surgeon. He was both by trade and by law, by training and by the only chair he owned. The chair was the same chair. The blade was often the same blade. The hand was the same hand. The popular version of the pole is a quaint old emblem of a haircut shop. That version begins to crack the moment you ask what was being dried on it, and why, and what other work the man holding the cloths was being paid to do that afternoon. It begins to crack further when you realize the customer who came in for a shave might be the same customer who came back the next week for bloodletting, and the week after that for the extraction of a rotten tooth, and might, if gangrene set into a wound that summer, end the season in that same chair, gripping the same post while the barber took up a saw. The barber did not choose surgery. He inherited it. Around the year 1000, the men who cut hair inside monasteries were responsible for keeping monks clean-shaven. The tonsure was a religious obligation, and a monk who could not shave himself depended on someone who could. Those barbers lived among the sick. They had access to sharp blades. From that proximity, they began to take on bloodletting and minor procedures, cupping, lancing, the draining of humors that the monastery's own infirmary required. By the 11th century, monastic infirmaries were performing real surgery. Stone cutting for bladder stones, the setting of broken bones, the treatment of wounds from travelers and pilgrims who arrived at the monastery gate. The monk barbers were the hands inside those infirmaries. Some of them traveled, some served bishops and kings. The boundary between the religious and the surgical was already thin, and the church knew it. The Council of Tours in 1163, under Pope Alexander III, was the first well-attested attempt to draw clergy away from the blade. This time, the language was sharper. Clergy were forbidden from performing any procedure involving blood. The Fourth Lateran Council, half a century later, extended the prohibition to nearly all surgical practice and confirmed it as binding across the Latin Church. What the decrees actually did was not create a new profession. They created a vacancy. The clergy had to step away from the blade. The lay people who were already closest to it, the barbers already in the monastery courtyards and the parish shops, took up the work. There was no campaign. There was no moment where barbers petitioned for the right to cut flesh. There was a job that needed doing, and men who already had the tools, and a class of educated gentlemen who had been told to leave the room. The barber's day, in the years after the decrees, often began with shaves. Customers came in with beards that needed trimming. The apprentice swept the floor, stropped the razors, laid out the clean cloths. By mid-morning, the work might shift. A woman brought a child with a swollen jaw. A man came in with a leg ulcer that would not heal. A traveler arrived from the road with a wound that had turned black. The barber drew the curtains. He washed his hands, if he washed them at all. He took up the same blade he had used on the morning's chins. The chair did not move. By evening, the cloths were stained. They were hung on the pole outside the shop to dry, twisting in the wind, advertising to the next morning's customers what kind of work had been done inside. The transition out of the monasteries was not dramatic. It was administrative. The barber who took over the infirmary in the year 1200 was often the same man who had been holding the razor for the monks the year before. The work did not change when the rule changed. The man's status did. This is the buried origin. Surgery in the medieval sense was not seized by barbers. It was abandoned by monks and picked up by the people standing nearest when it hit the ground. The barber-surgeon profession that resulted was not a triumph of lay medicine. It was the residue of a religious compromise, written into the trade by default rather than by design. In the medieval hierarchy of medicine, the surgeon was not at the top. The university physician stood there. He had studied at Salerno, Montpellier, Bologna, or Paris. He read Galen and Hippocrates in Latin. He diagnosed by observation and theory the four humors, the balance of the body. His hands were for writing prescriptions and feeling pulses. They were not for opening bodies. To touch blood, pus, a wound was manual labor. It was the work of a craftsman, and craftsmen were servile. A physician who cut flesh had given up his standing. The boundary between learning and labor was drawn at the skin. Below the physician stood two kinds of surgeons. The long-robed surgeons of the confraternity of Saint Cosmas, established in France in the 13th century, were university trained. They wore robes that fell to the floor. They lectured on anatomy. They directed operations. The short-robed surgeons, the barber-surgeons, actually performed them. Hands on the patient, blade in the flesh, blood on the apron. The confraternity of Saint Cosmas sat in an uncomfortable middle position. They were learned, they published, but they operated with the same instruments as the barbers and dressed wounds the same way. The physicians of the Paris faculty regarded the confraternity with suspicion. The confraternity regarded the barbers with contempt. The hierarchy was rigid. The work was shared. And the barbers, who did most of it, kept their place at the bottom of the table even as the patients they saved walked out of their shops. The barber-surgeon was paid less, trained less formally, read no Latin. He was apprenticed young, often at 13 or 14, and bound to a master for 7 to 9 years. He learned by doing. The barber-surgeon was not ignorant. He knew the body's geography the way any craftsman knows his material. He had cut into enough abscesses to know where the pus sat. He had set enough bones to know the angle at which they knit. He had bled enough patients to know who would faint and who would not. What he lacked was the Latin, the theory, the published case, the social seal of a university. When a physician was called to a wealthy household, he would diagnose from a urine sample and a pulse. then write a recipe for herbs or bleedings. The barber-surgeon would carry out the bleeding, often the next morning, in the patient's home or in his own chair. The two professions operated in tandem for centuries. The physician's signature was always above the barber's hand. Then the inversion. In 1540, Thomas Vicary, sergeant-surgeon to Henry VIII, persuaded the king to merge the Worshipful Company of Barbers, incorporated in 1462, with the Guild of Surgeons. The famous Holbein painting of Henry VIII presiding over the barber-surgeons commemorates the moment. A large oil-on-oak painting composed of multiple oak panels, showing the king handing the new company its charter. The act granted the merged company 4 executed criminals a year for public dissection, the foundation of formal surgical training in England. Vicary himself was barber-trained. He had risen through the trade to become sergeant-surgeon, the king's own cutter of flesh. The merger was not a hostile takeover. It was an acknowledgement that the trade the physicians would not do had become indispensable to the crown. In 1745, the surgeons broke away. The Company of Surgeons formed on its own. By 1800, the company had a royal charter as the Royal College of Surgeons in London. By 1843, it took its current name, the Royal College of Surgeons of England. The institution that trains the most prestigious surgeons in the British system descends directly from the Company of Barbers. The same institution that once ranked lowest in medicine now ranks highest. There is one more residue. English surgeons today are still addressed as Mr., not Doctor. The tradition dates to the period around 1800, when aspiring surgeons, who had to obtain a medical degree and the title doctor to qualify for membership in the new college, were then expected to revert to Mr. once they were admitted, a snub from the Royal College of Physicians that refused to share the title. The 1843 charter, which created the fellowship, cemented the convention. Over 2 centuries, the snub became a trophy. The surgeon's Mr. is now the most prestigious title in the operating theater. Patients who would not dream of calling a heart surgeon doctor still call him Mr. with a kind of reverence. The barber's mark turned into the physician's crown. The inheritance ran through hands, not just institutions. Ambroise Paré was a barber-surgeon. He began as an apprentice at the Hôtel Dieu, the great Paris hospital where the poor went to die or to recover. And from 1537, he served as an army surgeon. He would serve 4 kings of France and die in 1590, having spent his life in the trade the physicians would not touch. The Hôtel Dieu, where Paré apprenticed, was not the hospital of modern myth. It was a crowded, airless ward where the dying lay 3 to a bed and the surgeons worked by candlelight. Plague, gangrene, and childbed fever moved through its corridors. Paré learned surgery the way all barber surgeons learned it, by doing it on patients who could not afford a physician, with instruments the physicians would not deign to use. On the battlefield, the work was amputation. The standard method was cauterization, a red-hot iron pressed against the open stump to sear the arteries closed. When Paré saw his first amputation, the patient, often a soldier with a shattered limb from cannon fire, was held down by 4 men. The surgeon took up the saw and worked quickly, the way all surgeons had worked for centuries. The arteries spurted. The iron came out of the fire, glowing, and was pressed into the stump. The patient screamed once and then stopped. Sometimes, the stopping was the body's shock response. Sometimes, it was death. Paré watched this for years. Then, in 1552, he reintroduced the ligature, a thread tied tight around the bleeding vessel, a technique that had been described by Galen and the Arab surgeon al-Zahrawi centuries earlier and had been lost to the European craft. With the ligature, the iron stayed in the fire. The mortality fell. He also designed the bec de Corbin, the raven's beak, a precursor of the modern hemostatic clamp. He described phantom limb pain, the sensation of agony in a limb that no longer existed, which he observed in amputees and recorded in his published treatise on surgery in 1564. He was admitted to the confraternity of St. Cosmas in 1554 with the support of the king and had been made surgeon to Henry II in 1552. Paré's case is the inheritance made flesh. He was not a physician. He was a craftsman who had learned his trade in a hospital ward and on a battlefield. He never read Galen in the original. He wrote his treatise in French, not Latin. The physicians of the Paris faculty regarded him as they regarded all barber surgeons, with the formal contempt reserved for a man who earned his living with his hands. The kings he served regarded him as indispensable. He died in his own bed at 80 with honors. The speed of his work and the economy of gesture was the inheritance of the trade. Surgery had been built by men who had to be fast because the patients had no anesthesia. That imperative passed forward, even as the trade itself changed. Robert Liston, working in London in the 1840s, was a university-trained fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons. He cut a leg in under 30 seconds. He told his students to time him, stopwatches out, the clock running from the first incision to the final ligature. He was the fastest surgeon of his generation. But his speed was not the inheritance of an illiterate trade. His speed was the inheritance of a profession that had been built by illiterate men, on a premise that had outlived the men themselves. Liston had been trained in anatomy, in pathology, in the new science of surgery that the Royal College had begun to teach. None of that changed the imperative. The patient on the table must be off it as quickly as possible. The trade had established that imperative. The college had inherited it without examining it. Liston was not a villain. He was the inheritor of a tradition that had been built for centuries around a premise he had never been asked to question. He cut fast because fast was what surgery had always been. He told his students to time him because timing was how he had been taught to measure success. The stopwatch was not his invention. It was the trade's. When ether was first used at University College Hospital in London in 1846, the surgical establishment watched a patient slip into unconsciousness and then watched the surgeon work at a pace no one had ever worked at before. The patient did not scream. The surgeon did not rush. The clock did not matter. The era of speed was, in principle, over. In practice, it would take a generation for the new pace to settle into the hands of men who had been trained to count in seconds. The barber-surgeon profession was formally dissolved in 1745. The barber-surgeon's imperative lived on in Liston's stopwatch. The split in 1745 was only the formal end. The barber-surgeon had been fading for a century before that, replaced at the top by surgeons who were beginning to learn anatomy at universities and to publish their own textbooks. The new surgeons had every reason to rewrite their genealogy. They had become learned. They had become prestigious. They wanted to be associated with the confraternity of St. Cosmas and the university tradition, not with the men who had pulled teeth in shop chairs. The barbers were a useful origin for advertising. They were an embarrassing origin for a profession. The literacy asymmetry was structural. The medieval physician read Galen in the original. He wrote in Latin. He could publish a case history and have it survive in the libraries of Europe. The barber surgeon wrote nothing, or wrote in the vernacular and lost it to fire and weather. The barber surgeon's apprentice learned by watching the master work, not by reading a manual. The manual, where it existed, was oral. The physician wrote the textbook. The barber told his son. The losers of the status war did not write its textbook. The popular version we have today is the version the surgeons wrote. The barber pole persists as a quaint shop sign. The bloodletting it advertises has been forgotten as the reason it exists. The textbooks, where they mention barber surgeons at all, treat them as a colorful footnote to real medical history, a delay on the road to modern surgery, not a stage of it. The barber pole itself is the persistence mechanism made physical. The practice that gave rise to it, bloodletting, has been obsolete for well over a century. The pole still spins outside every barbershop in the English-speaking world. It advertises work that no one in the shop does anymore. The connection to surgery has been severed in plain sight, which is precisely why the popular narrative feels innocent. The same cultural force that produced this forgetting was still operating in 1847. Ignaz Semmelweis, a physician at the Vienna General Hospital, ordered doctors in the first obstetrical clinic to wash their hands in chlorinated lime between autopsy work and patient examination. The death rate from childbed fever in that clinic had been running around 18 in 100. After hand washing, it fell below 2 in 100. The midwives' clinic next door, where students had not been dissecting cadavers, had been running low the whole time. Semmelweis was not a surgeon. He was a physician. He had crossed the line the physicians had drawn for themselves. Hand washing was manual labor, servile, beneath the dignity of a learned gentleman who had studied Latin. The 1847 directive was not the first time a physician had suggested washing. It was the first time the suggestion was enforced. And it was enforced by a man who had watched the death count and refused to look away. His own colleagues expelled him from his post in 1849. He left Vienna the following year. He died in an asylum in 1865, broken, just as Joseph Lister was beginning his antiseptic experiments in Glasgow. The contempt that pushed surgery onto barbers in the 12th century was still killing patients in the 1840s. The inversion is not a curiosity. It is a force. The pole outside the modern barbershop is surgery's family crest, not a haircut shop's decoration. The red and white still advertise the wound and the bandage, the blood and the cloth, 2 centuries after the practice ended. The barber's chair is the surgeon's chair. The blade is the same blade. Modern surgery, the most prestigious profession in medicine, was born from the most despised trade in the Middle Ages. The surgeon who greets you before anesthesia, in scrubs and a sterile glove, is the inheritor of a man who learned his craft on a battlefield and in a shop, with a sharpened razor and a borrowed saw. The university physician wrote the textbook. The barber wrote the chair. The surgeon you trust was born in that chair. The next time you walk past a spinning pole, you will see what it really is. Subscribe to the Origin portal if you want more origins the textbooks got wrong.